Beautiful song, Karen. That was lovely. Well, sometimes I think that time seems to have taken a new dimension since COVID time entered our lives. I'm not sure if it's just me, but it can be challenging to remember what happened, when it happened, and how it happened. And I wonder if any of you remember what you were doing exactly 1 year ago today. Okay, there are a few, good. What about 5 years ago today? No? Okay, what about 15 years ago today? No hands. Well, on Epiphany, that very first Sunday in January, I remember exactly what I was doing 15 years ago today. At about this time, on that first Sunday, I was stepping into this chancel area for the first time and into this sanctuary. And I remember what I was doing exactly 15 years ago, and about an hour from now, I was accepting your call to come to this congregation as one of your pastors. Times like this cause us to do some reflecting, to do some pondering. So I went back and I read the sermon that I preached on what was Epiphany Sunday, those 15 years ago. I don't need to tell you that a trial sermon can be a very unnerving experience. And I remember that I was a bit nervous, but I also remember the peace that I felt. God had been with me in the past, and I knew that God would be with me in this time of possible changes. And I trusted that if this were a good match, that it would be clear to you and to me. And it was, and it is, and here we are, 15 years later. I'm blessed to have been serving with you these many years. 15 years is a long pastorate, for sure, and it's been very good. Part of my coming here was the invitation to preach about once a month, and I welcome that. I think one of the things that's exciting about Scripture is that when we read it, when we study a very familiar passage, it can take on new meaning depending on what is happening in our world, perhaps what's happening in our lives. Think about how different our world is these 15 years later. Consider the following words that weren't on our radar, and even in our vocabulary in 2008. Uber, Airbnb, helicopter parent, air quotes, ginormous, oh yeah, coronavirus. A lot of words that we had never even heard of in 2008. And so this morning I'd like to explore again with fresh eyes the story of Epiphany, but also some new understandings and inspirations that I have found in this very familiar passage of the visitors from Eastern lands, the story of the wise men, our Epiphany text, read beautifully by Kirk and Quinn this morning. Epiphany is recognized worldwide on January 6th each year. The word Epiphany means manifestation or appearance and refers specifically to God's self-revelation in Jesus, literally shining upon. Outside of the sometimes liturgical references to Epiphany in our culture, and specifically in our own tradition, we haven't done a whole lot with this celebration. We don't have an Epiphany Eve candlelight service, and if January 6th doesn't happen to fall on a Sunday, we might miss it altogether. We tend to merge the story of the wise men right into the Christmas story. In our traditional Christmas pageants, the wise men join the angels and shepherds at the manger on Christmas Eve. But a closer look at the scriptures tells us that it was not so. We don't know exactly when the wise men or the Magi arrived. We don't know how long they had to follow the star. We do know that Jesus and Mary had moved. They are in a house when the Magi arrived. And in the original language, we find that Jesus is no longer a baby, but is what we might call a toddler, maybe as old as nearly 2 years. By that time, the shepherds had surely returned to their flocks and their fields. So it's good to separate this story, this Epiphany story, from the Christmas story, because it contains a message that warrants its examination apart from the manger. The role of the wise men in the Christmas pageants hardly allows us to perceive the full significance of the visit of the Magi. In this text, we discover the surprises that Matthew had in store, not only for his peers, but for us as well. The story begins with the Magi. Magi is a transliteration of a Greek word, which can also be translated astrologer, sorcerer, and magician. Often, erroneously, we refer to this story as the story of the three wise men, but each of those words can be called into question. Matthew doesn't specifically say that there are three. In fact, it really would have been customary at that time to have had such sages traveling in groups of 12, kind of like Jesus and the disciples. Time has assigned the number 3, perhaps because of the 3 gifts that are presented to the child. Or some suggest that there are 3 to represent 3 different races, possibly from Arabia, India, and Persia. And at some point, they were given proper names: Melchior, Caspar, Balthazar, which we've all heard, but which aren't in the biblical text. We also don't know exactly how wise they were. We do know that they were learned astrologers and probably considered scholars among the pagan elite. They may have had a great knowledge for their day, but we might question that they used wise judgment as they came to Judea and clearly made known that they were looking for the newborn king of the Jews. We've got to wonder if it didn't just occur to them that when King Herod got wind of this, he might just have felt threatened. After all, kingship was his turf. Just maybe it would have been wiser for them to have used some discretion in asking for directions. So 3, maybe, wise, possibly, but men? The Church of England uncovered some interesting information several years ago. Not only do they say that the word Magi discloses nothing about numbers or wisdom, but the English translations of the scriptures indicating that these were men may have done us another disservice. Magi is a gender-neutral word. Although it is unlikely, the possibility that one or more of the Magi were female cannot be excluded completely. Upon this announcement by the church, the press responded with a suggestion that instead of calling them the 3 wise men, the phrase several fairly sagacious individuals might be more accurate. But the church settled on Magi, and it stuck, and that's okay. If there's so much that we really don't know about the Magi, what do we do then? What do we know about them? Their religion was most likely Zoroastrianism. They were possibly held in esteem in their world as highly educated scientists and scholars. From the East, they were Gentiles, not Jews. It was commonly believed in the ancient world that signs in the heavens accompanied the births of great figures of these Magi, and these Magi observed a sign, a rising star, which indicated to them coming of a newborn king. This star brought together the 2 worlds, the pagan astrological hopes and the Jewish biblical promise. The star, too, is a mystery. Many people have attempted over the centuries to find scientific explanations for this phenomena. Some have thought it a comet, some the correct aligning of Jupiter and Saturn. Some have thought it a UFO or a supernova, but Matthew is clearly describing a miraculous occurrence. The star remains stationary while the Magi are in Jerusalem, consulting with King Herod. And then it leads them not only to Bethlehem, but to the precise location of Jesus, where it then stood still. This star defied the natural rotation of the earth. Although many of the details are a mystery, and some of what we have known of the story is legend, we do know that according to Matthew, a star signifying the appearance of a messianic king was recognized by Gentile Magi. And in that day, the world, both Jew and Gentile, knew, expected, and was waiting for a coming king. So not only did this star signify the birth of the Messiah for the Jews, Matthew clearly was telling his Jewish audience that not only the Jews, but all people, including Zoroastrian Magi, would follow the star. It was a promise of inclusion. Matthew's readers knew that these Magi were not from around here. They were not hometown Jewish folks with hometown values, hometown upbringing. To them, these were odd people from a strange land. But the Magi were compelled to follow that star, traveling however far, focused on that one thing. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. Our scripture says that when they saw Mary and Jesus, they knelt down and paid him homage. It must have been an incredibly moving experience for them, so much so that the learned Magi fell upon their knees and bowed to the ground. The response of the Magi to Jesus leaves no doubt about his regal status. Something deep inside these outsiders recognizes Emmanuel, God with us. They found themselves in the presence of God. And they opened their treasure chest and offered him gifts. We know specifically gold, frankincense, and myrrh, gifts fit for a king, but not so much a baby. There is great speculation as to why these gifts. Some suggest that they are a symbolic foreshadowing of what the future held for this child. Gold, of course, a gift for a king, incense for Jesus as divine, and myrrh, also an expensive aromatic gum for Jesus' death, used for embalming. Maybe they were a prediction of Jesus' life and death. Or maybe these three gifts were the elements that the Magi used in their work as they practiced magic and experimented with alchemy. So in giving the Christ child gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they were handing over the tricks of their trade. Well, there's a lot about this story that we don't and can't fully understand. We do know that the Magi encountered the presence of God and experienced an epiphany, a transformational moment that changed forever their lives. And the Magi have something to teach us, to model for us. They had prepared themselves well for that encounter. They had been studying. They knew their stuff. They hadn't merely stumbled onto this miraculous event. They had searched their own past and their sacred texts, and the result of their study was that they were ready and willing to recognize the sign, the star, when it appeared. These scholarly folk did not keep their noses in the book all the time. They were keen observers of the world around them. They were willing to ask directions, and not just the women. Even if the source wasn't the wisest, as in King Herod, they were open to help and to guidance. After seeing the child and having all of their hopes realized, they remained vigilant and attentive, open to further visions and insight, and they were responsive to their dream-delivered warning to go home by a different road. And maybe most importantly, after having found the confirmation of their convictions in finding Jesus, they responded with overwhelming gratitude and abundant generosity as they offered what they had and who they were, and they abounded in hope. We too yearn for a deeper encounter with God, especially as we begin a new year. And we have been given a model in this gospel account. We too can study our sacred text. We too can be attentive to what is going on around us. We too can seek guidance along the way and be open to new insights. This is Epiphany, and we are gathered together to follow that star. We have seen the star, and we know that it brings a shining light to darkness. We help each other to see the light of Christ, for sometimes our lives become very dark when we need others to carry the Christ light for us. We journey together as the gathered community of Christ, and we journey with sisters and brothers from all over the world, people that are dear and familiar, people we've never seen before, people who are young, people who are old, people from the East, people from the West, people who were tax collectors, people who were astrologers, people with a past. We all gather together to follow Jesus into God's future. As our culture closes the book on the Christmas story for this year, we know that the star still shines. As we hear the rest of the story today and throughout the year, we come to know more deeply the love that God has for us, this God who called the Magi to journey across the desert. May we abound in hope, just as the Magi, and may we pay homage. We open our treasure chests and we offer gifts. The scripture says that after being warned in a dream, the Magi left for their own country by another road. Everything had changed. After encountering the Christ, no one was the same. Besides, none of their old maps worked anymore, according to author Barbara Brown Taylor. And we return home by another road because our old maps don't work anymore. We have gathered to follow that star together, and we are walking into the new year of 2023 in the light of God, abounding in hope. God has been with us. God is with us. God will be with us. Thanks be to God.